Hello, everybody. My name is Felipe de Negri. I'll be your moderator. It is 8 o'clock on the dot. We're going to give folks a couple more minutes to come in. But thank you for being here. Welcome, and we'll start soon. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. Again, my name is Felipe de Negri. I am your moderator for today's session, and I had the good fortune of chairing the CIWP that we're going to be talking about for the next hour or so. So to sort of set the scene very quickly, we are here to discuss the results of the continuous improvement work. I'm seeing that I have an echo. Is that correct? Or can people hear me?
No, you're fine. Oh,
I'm
fine for me.
getting both. That's interesting. Okay, so I'm getting quite a few messages that it's okay. So to a couple of people that I'm seeing apparently have an echo, perhaps this is on your side, but thanks for the heads up. So what I was saying is that we're here to discuss the transition credits approach, continuous improvement work program results that was carried out by the ICVCM. The ICVCM, as everybody I'm guessing who is here knows, is a neutral integrity focused body that is seeking to support the high ambition implementation of carbon markets and carbon crediting elements. And CIWP's continuous improvement work programs are designed to explore complex and emerging issues. They don't endorse specific solutions and they don't represent a decision-making body, but rather produce inputs for other processes that then lead to decisions within the ICVCM and help inform that decision-making. And so this CIWP was on transition credit approaches, which are an emerging set of approaches, I would say, with a couple of methodologies out there and more apparently coming, focused on, at least initially, coal phase out, right, which is a critical goal for climate policy, especially in emerging markets, which have very young asset bases, right? There are some of these coal-fired power plants are very large and have been commissioned rather recently. And so we have, in theory, decades of potential emissions. And so figuring out how to retire these fossil fuel assets early is a critical part of the solution. and transition credit approaches are emerging as a potential tool to mobilize private finance and to sort of accelerate that shift to clean energy. They play a role within a much broader and deeper sort of financing stack for these transactions, but they can, analysis shows, unlock some of these transactions, and so are increasingly a source of interest. The concept, however, is novel, it's complex. There are important integrity questions, both on the sort of carbon technical side and on the just transition component of it. And so this CIWP was an initial attempt at starting to have these discussions and starting to find consensus on these elements to try to define what a robust, what a high quality transition credit approach or implementation would look like so that we can start having that conversation, right? The CIWP is a multi-stakeholder working group that was convened, but this is one of many CIWPs that work. The objective was to assess how high integrity, principles apply specifically to transition credits or transition credit approaches, and to identify potential refinements or additions that would be required for the current CCP assessment framework. It's again not this does not create a new asset class. It does not endorse any specific methodologies. It does not provide any specific input on CCP eligibility as such or anything like that. It is an initial attempt at starting to identify these elements of quality that would then go into a potential assessment. And so in terms of the discussion, and I promise I'll stop talking very briefly and move to our guests, there are in sort of the transition credit approach world, right, enormous opportunities, I would argue, and still substantial challenges. I will admit to having been rather skeptical when we started this journey of the approaches writ large, and I'm now quite convinced that there is a there. It's not an easy there to access, I think, and there is work to be done. But it seems to me that there is definitely a there, and that the potential is so enormous, both in scale and in possible ripple effects, of doing this well, that it is worth the effort of trying to do it with the emphasis on doing it right. And so in terms of the structure as such, we will have four elements. This short framing introduction. Our great panelists are going to introduce themselves in just a minute, and we're going to have a moderated discussion with them. Then we're going to have an audience Q&A, and I'll provide some brief closing remarks. And as you exit the webinar, you will get a screen with a very brief survey. We would be very appreciative if you can respond. Those help us improve these sessions and try to make these things better for everybody. So on that, I think we're moving first to a short video and then to the introductions of our participants, if I'm correct. Can we play the video? The video, I am told, is coming. Just a second. There we go. At least it's starting to show on mine. I'm not getting audio for the team. It's funny how these online videos are kind of like the projectors from before. They're always hard to make work. So apparently we will be having audio, but it's entirely captioned. Okay, let's go. Okay, so thank you, Leighton. Again, apologies for those audio issues, but they'll be resolved when this gets posted on the website. Um, and so now I'd like to very quickly introduce our three panelists and then give them a chance to introduce themselves. Mandy Ramberas, who is CEO at Vera, but who joined us more because she has very, very, very direct experience with just energy transitions, and she'll tell us a little bit more about that. Yuanji So, who is the Deputy Director at the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and Joseph Curtin, Vice President at the Rockefeller Foundation. So if you don't mind, Yuanji, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and get us kick-started?
Hello. I think I see a lot of people I don't know in the attendees. So, I'm Yuan Jie. I'm from the Authority of Singapore. I think our involvement in the CIWP was really from our work pulling together the transition credits coalition, which we did from 2023 to 2025. So just a quick plug here that we've actually put out a few reports over at COP29 and COP30. And I'll be speaking a little bit to that. But those are two documents that were products from the MAS with a lot of consultation with our industry stakeholders. So probably something that if you guys are interested, you should take a look at. Yeah.
Thanks. Joe.
Hey everyone, thank you, Felipe. I'm Joe Curtin. I'm a VP responsible for energy transitions at the Rockefeller Foundation, and I lead our Cult Clean programs in particular. And we have a very strong focus on asset-based approaches to retiring coal plants or avoiding their construction in the first place. And we believe by looking at specific transactions and replacing coal assets with dispatchable clean power and showing how that works in practice, that we can drive systemic change and build confidence in these new technologies and new financial approaches. And we think in that context, the transition credits are one important tool, one of many tools in the toolkit that can be deployed to that end. So back to you, Felipe.
Thank you so much. And last but most definitely not least, Mandy, please.
Thanks, Felipe. Hi, everybody. Mandy Ramros. I'm the CEO of Vera, former negotiator for Article 6 for South Africa. But as Felipe alluded to, I came to the CIWP wearing a different hat. I spent most of my career at Eskom, which is Africa's largest electricity utility, and significantly dependent on coal in its 100-year history. I wasn't there for 100 years, it felt that way, but it is a 100-year-old utility. And towards the latter part of my time at Eskom, I spent every waking moment working on our Just Energy Transition Plan. Tears, blood, sweat, and tears, literally in cases, but working from inside the utility and understanding the impacts on communities, on workers that were going to live with the consequences of this transition. So really on the ground experience in that respect. So all of these lenses, being now at Vera, Article 6 negotiations, and working on the first JETP that was agreed globally, all of those lenses have been brought to bear in the work that we're doing now. Thanks, Felipe.
Thanks so much, Mandy. And so now we're going to move into the sort of the meat of our discussion. And actually, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. As a few people have already mentioned, transition credit approaches have a strong emphasis on the just transition component, right? It's very much at the core of what this is. And I say that the principle is roughly understood widely, but there's no actual consensus definition, and that's part of what we discussed in the CIWP. So what does this actually look like in practice from your experience, and how can we manage different understandings of this as we move into this and still keep comparability?
Great, thanks, Felipe. It's a very comprehensive question, but I'll try and just be succinct about it. So as someone who's lived inside the JETP, and we started this work when there wasn't much to go on at the time globally, I think they now map very directly onto what we've discussed in the CIWP and what we see in the report, which is the four core elements, right? Early decommissioning, paired renewable replacement, just transition, and a pledge on no new coal plants. I would say that three lessons stand out. First, on the just transition, where we say no just transition, no credits, has to mean something operationally. So not just in words or in thoughts, but actually operationally. And this is really where the JETP struggled. We had we had at COP26 in Glasgow, $8.5 billion were pledged to the South African JETP. Of that, only 4% came in grants, and about 60% of that was in commercial loans. And I think a lesson that we learned is that if you have no measurable benefit sharing, if you can't see what the FPIC and the timing requirements are, that puts the just transition part before you actually shut down. Even these well-intentioned frameworks that we had gets hollowed out by these financial structures. So the financial structure, how we do all of that financial structuring and having upfront benefits declared is extremely important. And that is what we've built into VMD 61, which is a module linked to our methodology VM 52. It establishes criteria and procedures related to just transition. It has to be operationalized, quantified, time-bound, verifiable benefit sharing before, after, and during retirement. I think that's one of the most important lessons learned. I mean, the technology part is easy. Felipe, I've always said this to you. Doing the energy planning, the technology part was easy. The social impact, the social compact was the most difficult part. The second lesson I would say is the no new coal pledge. It's a hard integrity lesson, right? And that is what the JETP has shown us. The political economy of coal extension is very real. We have energy security pressures, utility dynamics, distribution failures. So the pledge for no new coal is a key enabler. It has to have credit integrity consequences because we need ownership of this framing. We need ownership by the country, by the IPP, the SOC, SOE, whoever's doing these projects and are involved. And this is where we see the same sort of country ownership and Article 6 coherence. We're having these same conversations. These projects will succeed or fail on whether host governments genuinely own this and IPPs genuinely own this. And then I think the third is on where we look at jurisdictional and project-based approaches, which we've also discussed in the CIWP. The JETP in spirit was a jurisdictional approach, and the lessons that we learned were very instructive. Jurisdictional approaches could perhaps deal with leakage risk and capture grid dynamics, but they do increase the financing risks, governance complexity is real, and time to market. Whereas with project-based approaches, they're faster, but they could carry greater leakage and additionality risk. So what we did in South Africa, we attempted something close to a jurisdictional model and ran into exactly these predicted constraints: transmission constraints, distribution constraints, replacement generation, and importantly, sovereign coordination was a big issue. So the binding constraint was not the system, was the system, not the intention. There were lots of hidden agendas and complexities when you deal with multi-stakeholders that you have to deal with. So that is why also in a module linked to VM52, module 60, VMD 60, we looked at the combined baseline and additionality logic, strictly no double counting on RECs, and conservative grid emission accounting during the transition period. We also have a condition in the methodology in VM52 that the system operator has to ensure that the accelerated retirement does not have negative impacts on the grid, on the community, on energy security. So all of those things are protected. So I think where we have the CIPW's articulation of combined or temporal additionality recognizes that early shutdown, and Felipe, you talked about some plants are young, but looking at early shutdown does create that headroom for renewable acceleration. Wouldn't have happened otherwise. But I think the shutdown itself is infeasible if we do not have a just transition. So I think that's one of the most important parts of the CIPW report. Thanks, Felipe.
Thank you, Mandy. Thank you for that very broad look at what has to happen to make this work. Now I'll turn to Joe to actually take us into hopefully a little bit of some of the weeds. One of the issues that keeps coming up in discussing these sorts of approaches are the pairing in renewables, right? Mandy alluded to this briefly in saying that we have to make sure that we don't have a negative impact on the grid, that we don't spike prices, that we don't hurt reliability. And one of the ways that is discussed, and one of the main ways that is discussed in these conversations, is with requiring some degree of deployment of renewable energy to replace basically the energy that is coming off grid with this shutdown. But there's a lot of complexity there. Would you tell us a little bit about that, Joe?
Sure, and thank you, Felipe, for starting with just transition. I think, coming from the Rockefeller Foundation perspective, we're a very development-focused philanthropy, and if there's a trade-off between energy security or just transition on the one hand and climate on the other hand, unfortunately, we're not in a position to take that bet. So we really are looking at win-wins. So look, it's been a very long journey developing this methodology. We started with a blank sheet of paper 4.5, 5 years ago, and we really started with the problem statement. There's 10, 12 billion tons just of carbon emissions from coal in the power sector alone. And people told us, well, carbon markets, they're not really positioned to do something about that. And we kind of thought that's not really sustainable. If carbon markets can't support us to take on a challenge like this, like what are carbon markets doing? And I was saying this as someone coming in from the outside, someone who was working on power systems, someone who's working on the frontier of climate action. And so we started working on this methodology with Mandy and many other partners. Just transition was one issue that was very much at the foreground for us. Another issue, as you mentioned, was pairing. And, Felipe, my perspective on this is, there's many different perspectives on pairing and where we should set that threshold and how we should set that threshold. Everyone seems to have a different view. From my perspective, I think I could divide those views between people who come from a kind of a power systems perspective, who are very close to market, who are working very deeply, with energy utilities, with asset owners, who come from maybe a power system modeling background or an engineering background. And then on the other hand, the integrity kind of safeguarders of carbon markets. And, on the one hand, we have the power system experts, and they have sort of advocated for a flexible approach, setting a minimum threshold for pairing, somewhere maybe in the region of 25%. But having a really powerful incentive in these methodologies to go beyond that. And basically, if you get higher levels of pairing, you get higher amount of credits. And, they make a sovereignty argument here. Countries need flexibility to make their own energy decisions about their energy mix. One size does not fit all. Requiring 100% pairing will result or could result in inefficient investment and allocation decisions, which could drive up energy prices. And they would point out that regulators will never approve projects that undermine energy security, that undermine affordability, and that undermine reliability. On the other hand, you have carbon markets, we'll say that the integrity guardians of carbon markets, and they would say, well, we can't outsource responsibility for, integrity to regulators. We need to make sure that whatever we allow within a methodology, needs to deliver integrity. And they would argue for 100% pairing, and there is some, divergence within that community. 100% pairing can be by capacity or by generation. It can be by the project kickoff date or the end of the crediting period. But the core concern there is really around leakage. Anything less than 100% could potentially allow more fossil fuels to be deployed in the system elsewhere. Like, we feel we've captured that in our methodology, but anyway, there's still a sort of a residual concern. I would just give one example here. The Java Bali grid is instructive. There's already too much base load. And so if you require 100% pairing there, you're solving for a problem that doesn't exist. And I would sort of pose the question, is this really serving a climate outcome or just the optics of integrity? However, being provocative there, I would say my honest kind of position is that we are going to converge on some formulation around 100% of pairing. And I can see that being okay, to be honest, if that is where we land. The key caveat, I would say, is that we do need to allow for a realistic and a flexible interpretation of pairing. So I would particularly suggest that, this is something that is achieved towards the end of the crediting period. If you just look at it from an engineering perspective, building like potentially gigawatts of renewables and storage to replace a coal plant, takes time. So hopefully, the community can come together around a constructive solution. These different partners who are coming from different perspectives with different experiences can ultimately land on a place where everybody feels like they've been listened to, and we set the integrity bar incredibly high, but we allow really good projects to proceed. I think that's always the art of carbon markets. So back to you, Felipe.
Thank you so much, Joe. I think you highlighted something that is interesting, right? Because you put it in terms of pairing, but I think it applies to a lot of the questions here, which is this tension between how much can we outsource and still remain credible in what we're saying, right? Just transition elements will, I think, likely in a lot of cases have to deal with some level of collaboration with government, etc. And so how much of that can be outsourced while remaining sort of credible and ensuring that the deliverables are delivered, right? So it's definitely a question, an open question and a discussion that's very important. And I think you also highlight another interesting issue, which is how much of this tension that I think has always been there for carbon credits, but is quite salient, I think, in transition credit approaches, where how much of this is responsive to the specific circumstances in the grid or in the country that you're talking about. Because if you want to talk about a single grid, a lot of these questions are very simple to answer. The complexity comes when you try to say, how do we create a thing that applies equally to every other grid, right? And so this balance between taking simple and relatively broad approaches, but that usually take really big, really deep cuts in things, or taking more nuanced and more specific approaches, which often, I would argue, deliver better results, but that come with an enormous amount of complexity and enormous amount of difficulty. And so is it a better result if you ultimately derail the project, right? And that tension is there not just for pairing, it's there for the just transition component, it's there for a lot of the management of such a large transition, right? That's the difficult part, but that is exactly, I would argue, the attractiveness. This is, I would say, if this is done well, it is transformational for a grid, and that is the name of the game. And on that, I'll pass over to Yonji to tell us a little bit about, sort of from their experience in the real world, are there specific regional factors that shape how this work needs to be implemented?
Yeah, thanks, Felipe. I think, of course, we sort of formed Traction from Singapore, and many of the Traction members are very much operating in the Asian region. I think you made a point about the sheer complexity is something that we continue to see. And I guess a few characteristics about Asia, I think in particular that is worth bringing up. I think the relative high reliance on coal as a cheap form of energy, together with, well, there is some development, I would say, that generally in terms of the renewable energy supply and infrastructure that is ready for you to replace en masse is still fledgling. So it is, I guess it also sort of strikes true with what Mandy talked about in her experience as well. And then with that, you also have Asia sort of, having still developing as an economy, with rising energy needs. And with that, you have coal as an affordable source. So you have high demand that is going to increase, and tight constraints that you have in terms of the replacement at the moment, which is, I guess, then was very effective that you started this whole conversation with the conversation on just transition, which will be a very key element of what will form credible transition credit projects, and trying to run the coal transition in this region as well. And with that also, I feel that in terms of the way that transition credits and its integrity requirements are being structured, there is a potential, right, essentially to channel that kind of revenue precisely to these just transition requirements. I will also add that I think in terms of some things that we've also found out, that is that I think governments and generally energy ministries and the grid, they need to be they play a key role in setting clear policies and energy plans. And this is also speaking to what Mandy said about the no new coal requirements, which is a very key component to ensure that your credits don't leak, right? Because you introduce another coal plant into the system. I think from a very practical perspective, that needs to be defined for the jurisdiction in play, to how do you define that sort of no new coal commitment into proper steps for that jurisdiction to take in to ensure that one, there's no leakage of the transition credits, and yet the government interest in terms of energy security is still met. And with regard to energy security, in the traction conversations that we've been having over the past 2 years, a lot of it was about how to balance fossil fuel sources and carrier energy to make up for the variability of your renewable energy replacement. And that was a constant thing that we needed to deal with. Also speaks to what Joe was talking about, the renewable energy replacement. But I think, over the past few weeks to months, I think this concept of energy security has evolved as well, even from the wider conversation that we have with our financial institutions, to also encompass the concept of being less reliant on global fossil fuel supply chains, because now we have literally felt that it could be disrupted very quickly. And I actually think that this is a right opportunity for the region to consider diversification in our region's energy sources, really from a security perspective. And to that end, transition credits can also be considered as a way to accelerate, develop, and secure some of these alternative sources of energy for the region. One last point I'd like to make is that I think in terms of we're talking about transition credits, but it should never be seen as one solution point or one silver bullet, but it's really a part of a wider range of approaches. There are multiple papers on this. For example, from the Coal Transition Commission on some of the other pathways, including flexibility in cooperations, repurposing, that they've put out papers on that are worth a read, and really to cast what we are talking about here in that context and in that wider energy grid. I think what's also interesting development that we've been following is that we've been speaking to the International Energy Agency throughout that traction process and even after, and they've also taken an interest in transition credits. I think for the audience here, probably something to look out for is coming mid-May, they will be publishing their own view on transition credits. And I think their view will be also incredibly interesting, because now they will have that, sort of regulator, policy, grid operator kind of perspective to it, which will bring in a lot more color. Yeah, so I'll stop here. Thanks, Felipe, for the question.
Thanks. Definitely looking forward to that report. One of the things I think that this set of approaches brings out is the interplay between the project level and the system level, right? Whether we're looking at this from the sort of project-based methodologies or from the jurisdictional sort of methodologies, in any case, you are talking about the interaction between a single asset or a set of single assets, but ultimately single assets, right? Single PPAs and single plants, with this broad grid and this huge mass of stakeholders and players, that at the electric level, right? And then, of course, the core just transition component, which I would argue, and I think the panelists here have run in that same direction, is as strictly as core to this process as the quantification of the carbon credits, right? It is not a marketing ploy or part of making this nice. It is part of making this literally implementable and viable to carry out. And so it becomes important. It becomes part of what has to be monitored and what has to be tracked and what has to be accounted for in a different way than we have engaged with sustainable development and with safeguards and with these kinds of things in the past. So we'll talk a lot about coal in this context. I'll highlight that one of the things that we discussed in the CIWP was, is this only about coal? And I think the group agreed that it's not just about coal. There are nuances to that, right? To which fossil fuels and how that interacts. But the sense of the group was that this could apply to more than just coal. I think we all tend to go back into talking about coal because this is where it has been most there is the most experience in relating to coal, and it's where a lot of the initial sort of work is happening. But this has a potential to apply more broadly. And so I'll ask, and any of you, the panelists who feels like they want to pick up on this, looking ahead, if this works, right? Talk us very briefly through how this plays out if we get it right. Is anybody willing to take that leap?
I can, Mandy, do you want to? I'll be brief. I mean, look, I think that what we're trying to do here is create a sort of a project archetype, which brings together the retirement of a coal asset, its replacement with dispatchable clean power in a manner that deals deeply with the just transition implications of that transaction. And what I believe it can do, if there's not enough carbon credits in the world, even including like compliance demand, etc., to shut every one of the 4,500 coal plants in emerging economies using transition credits. But what we talk to asset owners, we talk to policymakers all of the time. There is not a deep trust nor an awareness of the real progress that has been made with financial innovations and technological innovation. It has not caught up with the reality. And what we can do here is have a demonstration effect. We can demonstrate that this is possible, and thereby you engender a conversation about, well, how can we change our regulations, our rules, our frameworks? There's a lot of path dependency in terms of how power systems are developed. And even against the current energy security backdrop, some decision makers are saying, oh, well, we need to go back to coal because that's familiar and that's, reliable, affordable, etc. But actually, what we want to prove is that clean dispatchable power can do that work and can do it with increased affordability, increased reliability, reduced dependence on imported fossil fuels. And so really the point here is a couple of vanguard projects and, demonstrating that kind of a systemic kind of transition and a responsible transition is possible.
Thanks, Joe. I love the notion of demonstration and of proving this is possible. A really, really great man said it seems impossible until it's done, no? And on that, Mandy.
Yeah, can I just add to that? So yeah, absolutely great, man. You also said that as soon as you climb one mountain, you see the next one, right? And I think, when you said, how do we make sure that we define things properly and look at what is it that we mean when we say shut down, when we say replacement capacity, when we say just transition. So I'd use another quote to say that plans are nothing and planning is everything. I must say that for me, one of the big things, if you take a step back, Felipe, based on your question, is you have to have proper planning in place. And I glibly said earlier that the technology part is easy. It is, but you have to have proper planning. And when we did the plans in South Africa, we looked at shutting down 22 gigawatts, right? That's a lot of electricity. But shutting down 11 plants over time, that added up to 22 gigawatts, which is only about 40% of the capacity in any case. But linked to that, you also have to look at, if you shut down 22 gigawatts of coal, what do you use to replace it? And it's not just saying, oh, we'll use renewables. You have to plan for it. I've learned more about Plexos modeling in that time than I ever need to know for a lifetime. But you'd really need to look at the system impacts, right? Shutting down coal, what do you replace it with? What type of storage you need? Grid impacts. Do you need to look at synchronous condensers where you're shutting down parts of a plant that really support a grid in a very isolated area? You can't just shut down the plant, so you have to plan for all of that. And I talked about the condition in our methodology where the system operator has to make sure of grid stability and energy security and all of those things. But as Joe said, integral to that, you have to plan for the just part. It's not an add-on, it's an integral part. From my experience, when we spoke to communities on the ground, when we were looking at shutting down, and we did shut down a plant just before I left Eskom, when you speak to people on the ground, it's not just those guys working at the plant, right? They have generations, their dads and granddads and grandmothers all worked at the plant at some point as well. Generations of people living in a community because they work at the power plant or at the coal mine. So you can't just plan for the impact on your immediate staff that belong to the utility or wherever it might be. You have to look at the impacts of the scope of workers all linked to that plant, to that coal mine. You would know, coal plants are built where the coal is because in South Africa at least, it's easier to transport water than it is to transport coal. So you build a coal plant right next to the coal mine. But there are thousands of people employed by that mine, by that coal plant. They're not in the best places in the world. So those communities are fully committed to those things. So when you do the planning, you have to look at the scope of affected people. You have to look at sequencing, stakeholder engagements, all of that, long before you even start to talk about shutting down the plants. And you have to look at how do you plan for these workers, how do you plan for the communities, how do you plan for the contractors, all of that. And it as you said already, it's complex, it's a lot of work, but if you don't have those plans in place, you will fail. So you can't just go out and say, we're going to shut down this power plant and build renewables. You have to have proper planning in place.
Thank you, Mandy. And now, before we turn to the Q&A, one last question for the group. We've talked a lot about the potential, right? And there's an enormous amount of potential. And I'll ask each of the three of you to give me an answer. What is your number one concern? What is the number one challenge we need to address and get right to bring about this potential and sort of deliver on it there? We've discussed a lot of it, but for each of you, what is your number one thing we need to get right for this? You haven't gone in on this set. Let's start with you.
Yeah. I think for me, probably not specific to what to get right per se, because I feel like a smattering of things need to be gotten right together. But I thought and this is an issue that we had in the journey we had with the Transition Credits Coalition, was that I think what is quite important now is really to start to have the pilots and to really get someone to go into the weeds of doing the actual projects. Because even as we were having all those conversations, a lot of it, yes, we do have the 2 pilot projects in the Philippines, but they are 2 projects with very specific circumstances, and we need more of those use cases to be brought up and then to be talked about and to really surface and either validate whatever we put out in the traction report or disprove some of those things and the mechanisms that we came up with, right? So I thought that is of most importance. And I think just to add to that, I think right now is a very interesting time because work in all parts of the ecosystem in this transition credit space is firing up, right? We've got a few and a good critical mass of methodologies that's already swimming in the market. We've got Joe and team doing the pipeline work. We've got IEA with their focus on this as well. And we've got a kind of like a global shifting paradigm on what energy security means, which I think is a very exciting time, and there can be opportunities to be had, particularly for this mechanism. So I thought that was something that was on the top of my mind when you asked that question. Thanks.
Thank you. That was a fantastic answer. Joe, please.
Yeah, look, the scale of demand that is required to make these huge transactions happen, we're going to need to unlock sovereign demand. I would say the number one source of sovereign demand is going to be the EU. The EU has opened itself up to 5% of international credits. That can be up to 700 million tons of credits. So that's the number one thing we need to do. But Felipe, to sort of shoehorn another number 2 in there, what we need and what we're hearing from DG Klima and from many others, policymakers in Canada, in Singapore, in the UK, in Japan, is we need to prove that this is possible in practice. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg because we need the demand, to prove to get one transaction closed. And there is one transaction, obviously, people are aware of that we're all collectively working on, the SL Tech transaction in the Philippines. So the bit of a chicken and egg, we need one transaction. Getting from 0 to 1 will be the hardest thing we can do. And to make that happen, we need to have at least 2 sovereign off-takers, along with a collection of voluntary carbon market off-takers at the table. And we need to bring that complicated structure together.
Thank you, Joe. It's yeah, that shift from 0 to 1 is the only thing that doesn't work in increments, right? It's an absolute. On that, Mandy.
Yeah, thanks. I think, Joe and Wanji both covered it, but learning by doing, we need to stop over-analyzing and over-engineering and just start implementation, because that's the only way we're going to learn. But I will add just 2 things, sorry, Felipe. One is financing stack. So when you look at shutting down plants, the transition credits are not going to be the only thing that will make it happen. It's the topping of a financing stack, right, that will make that happen. So getting in the sovereign support, all of that Joe mentioned, is extremely important to push the needle on this. And the second is quantifiable just transition benefits. Being able to have transparent verification and quantifiable just transition benefits are extremely important to happen. So I would say those are the 2 important things.
Thank you, Mandy. And so we're going to move quickly to the question and answer session. We have a few questions that have been consolidated because I can quickly answer them quite factually, and then we've got a couple more for the group at the end. One of the questions asks about whether these are credits that can be traded in voluntary markets, and what that means in places like Europe, where a lot of the coal is expected to be phased out anyway because of other regulations, right? And so my answer to that would be that yes, these are carbon credits in every other sense. We call them transition credits because they come from a specific set of approaches, in the same way we call them forestry credits if they come from a forestry sector. But they are ultimately carbon credits, and so they would be intended to be traded. And part of the ensuring that they are high quality, robust, etc., is ensuring that they are not being generated from activities that we're going to shut down anyway, right? And understanding what are the requirements in these methodologies to ensure that they can only be applied to facilities that are going to continue operating, and where we are actually accelerating and meaningfully accelerating the shutdown of these facilities is a big part of this. We've got another question on the possibility of switching to intermediate fossil fuels like gas or so-called transition fossil fuels, such as gas, as part of this. My understanding is that all of what we discussed was strictly in the realm of replacing with renewables. I have a hard time imagining the carbon math working, right? If you're putting up a new gas-powered asset of this scale at this time, you are going to be running it for a substantial amount of time, and it's hard to imagine that that's going to cash out in terms of carbon emissions. So yeah, all of the discussion here has been about replacing with renewables, not with other fossil fuels. And I think, yeah, those were the ones I think I had off the top of my head that could be answered quite simply. I will actually leave to the group one of the more complex ones for any takers. One of the things we've discussed is the importance of a no new coal, right, in the context of shutting down a coal power plant. And Mandy has highlighted that this was complex in the case of South Africa, and we know that like these pledges can be broken. And so the question is, what happens if they're broken? What happens to the credits that have been issued? What happens to the future of the project? We discussed this at length in the CIWP, but I would like to hear your views on this very critical issue.
So Felipe, if I may just jump in, I think this is why a requirement is to have irrevocable commitment to coal shutdown. We experienced in South Africa, we put coal plants in mothballs, return them after 20 years in mothballs. So it's possible, right? It's huge engineering feat, impressive in ways, but it's possible. But it was a time when energy security was a problem. So I think it's extremely important that if that happens, that there are consequences to the credit integrity. It is a hard line to take, but it really is an important line to take, because we have to have real commitment. As you said at the beginning of the webinar, it could be extremely controversial. You were not convinced about the transition credits yourself. And if we have people going back on these pledges, there has to be credit impact consequences, because otherwise you mess with the integrity of the system. And we really do not want to mess with the integrity of the system. So I think we have to take a hard line on that one.
Thank you, Mandy. Yeah, another making the impossible possible with that feat of engineering. Joy and G, either of you want to step in on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I'll offer a perhaps slightly controversial view here. Most developing economies are still, at the very least, coal curious. And, so for example, the Philippines has a coal moratorium. So anything that was not approved and had achieved financial close at a certain point, no new coal applications are kind of possible. That's a moratorium. It's not a pledge to achieve no new coal. We absolutely have to be working in those countries. Those are the countries where the climate challenge will be won or lost. If we just wave our hands and say, oh, you are not pure enough for us to consider you a target country for this solution, if you are not pure enough for us to consider you a sort of appropriate recipient of climate finance and carbon finance, then we're just, I don't know what we're doing here. And so we need to build into our methodologies an extremely conservative, comprehensive, robust approach to understanding what the implications of one project would be on the jurisdiction, on the power system. We have to develop approaches to dealing with leakage that are extremely robust. And, for me, that's the priority, telling countries that, that they can't, saying that you need to have some sort of purity test before we will work in a country, I think is setting the bar too high, and would quite frankly rule out projects in most of the important countries that we would consider working in. For example, India, Philippines, and dozens of other countries. We need to demonstrate to these countries that the clean, reliable alternatives can do the job. That's what the whole point of this program is. And so I would say that we need to be realistic there. I think what the Vera methodology, by the way, calls for, I think makes a lot of sense, which is that the project developer needs to have a no new coal commitment.
Yeah. And Felipe, can I just add one thing as well? I agree with Joe on the tempered approach. Is we're not talking about shutting down plants overnight. And that was always one of the worries about the JETPs. This is a long-term commitment, right? And it's talking about shutting down plants in a phased approach over time. So I think that's very important to understand as well in this scenario.
Thanks. One question in the chat that maybe you might refer to, because he's brought this into a couple of his answers, which is the role the current war situation in Iran is causing, right? And sort of the ripple effects of that. A lot of people, I think, intuitively would expect that to move countries towards coal and as a sort of a backup rate. But I have also heard the opposite, right? Where in some countries this is highlighting how why am I going to move from one international liability to the other international liability when I can just get out of the game? So will you tell us a little bit more about what you're hearing on the ground about this?
It's relatively recent, so I'll try. I think Felipe, you've sort of characterized the two camps quite succinctly. Basically, you have a camp who think, okay, I'm gonna revert back to whatever's the safest and the easiest, i.e. coal. But you also have another camp who's really considering, the possibility of ramping up their renewables. And in this sense, also because of the potential speed there's a difference between when you build solar panels and a full, coal fossil fuel plant. There's a difference in that. And also the fact that it is I mean, if you have a renewable energy project, it is somewhat captive, and you are able to access that versus being sort of reliant on some kind of a fossil fuel chain somewhere. So I would say it is what we get, and this is more not really from the traction conversations, because they are past and they were pre-war conversations, but the conversations we have with a lot of the financial institutions engaged in the energy sector, we effectively have these two camps. And this is very interesting, because then I think actually there is a potential here to shape that narrative as well, to basically use transition credits and all the different pathways that you want to implement for the coal transition, to really pad up that case, right? To be able to get en masse the narrative to the other side of the house, which is to try to build up, basically you have a chance now to not revert back to the old stuff, then this is a good opportunity to try the new stuff. And I think that is that would be a very interesting conversation to have. Yeah.
Thanks. I see Joe makes another good point in the chat that coal prices are up 40% since this started. So that also plays a role in it not being the best hedge, perhaps. I see that there's a question in the Q&A that has come up a couple of times about this applying to fossil gas power plants and their replacement with renewables. That's part of what was discussed in the CIWP. We didn't actually reach a final conclusion on this from the discussions we had. It did not seem applicable to natural gas or fossil gas because of the dynamics, its specific dynamics. But I believe, and I could be wrong on this, that the recommendation of the CIWP was to look into the different fossil fuels and what the implications might be, because we recognized that there are important differences not only in the fuel but in the use cases, right? When you're talking about a captured power plant versus something that's connected to the grid and things like this. So there was discussion about this, but not necessarily a final answer. And on that, I recognize we're basically out of time. So I would like to thank our fabulous panelists for their insights and their contributions. I'd like to thank our audience for participating and staying with us. And of course, to everybody who participated in the CIWP, I know there are a few people from the group who are here. So thank you as well. The recording will be available on our website. And I hope you found this interesting. I hope you'll join us for the next one. Have a good day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.